I'm not sure if you know it. The church, the gathering of the people on a Sunday morning, we have a direct conflict that's before us at all times. Especially if you ever work at a church someday, you're going to find out that on Sunday mornings, we have competition for attendance at all times. We have to deal with, like, how do we make sure that our people want to come to this rather than this atrocious and terrible thing that exists in the culture today? Because right now, you can choose either or. Do I go to church, or do I do this thing? You know what this thing is? It's brunch. That's right. Brunch. Yeah, brunch is real good too, right? I mean, we've got to ask the question, is going to church better than brunch? Because I don't know about you, but sometimes an omelet and orange juice at like 10:30 in the morning with some friends, that sounds pretty good time. Now, of course, in COVID times, you've got to ask, is that question still there? But statistically, people are leaving the church even before COVID. And now it's like COVID has actually made people stop and reflect. And some people have actually said to themselves, you know what? Going to church didn't really add a whole lot of quality to my life, because now that I don't have to go to church because of COVID, I can do other things. So in this chat right now, in this video, we're going to talk about what is church. And some people might go about it in some interesting and dogmatic theological manner. Theological ways is what I should have said. But I would just like to give you a few analogies, and then let's do something a little different. We're going to define the church by its opposite. And that, by the way, its opposite is not brunch. If you were to have a Bible with you, and you look at, let's say, Genesis 7, 8, 9, that's the story of the flood. The early church, the early pastors of the church in the 1st and 2nd century, they likened the church to being kind of like Noah's Ark. Did you know that? That in this boat, you can find life. Outside of this boat, you'll probably drown. And there, you know what? There is some truth to that. Because everyone needs a collection of people that you can cling on to when there's a flood, when there's a massive storm happening around you, and you have nowhere else to go, because anywhere else you'd be treading alone. But at least with the church, you're in the storm together. So that's a good image, right? Another one in Ephesians 2, Paul talks about the church is like a temple that's built of people, and Jesus is the chief cornerstone. But here's another one that I really like. When Adam is created and then God sees that he needs Eve around, God takes a rib and then he creates Eve from that. Well, there's this German theologian, Hans Urs von Balthasar, fantastic name. He says the church is kind of like when Jesus is hanging on the cross and Jesus gets pierced by the spear. It's almost like in his crucifixion, we were reaching for his rib. And then the church is built off of the wound that came from the side of Jesus. You're like, oh man, this imagery is beautiful, right? Well, that's 3 images from the Bible. But in all honesty, just last night, I was having a catch up with 2 friends, Mark and another guy, Randy. And both of them are pretty smart guys. And I presented them with the question, what is the church? And they didn't use stories. They didn't do anything like that. They said 3 words instead. They said, well, the church at its best, Randy said, the church at its best is vulnerable. I was like, oh, that's good. And then he went another step further. And he said, and the church at its best is transparent. You can see right through it. You know all of its motives. You see the people for who they are. I was like, that's really good too. And then my other friend, Mark, he says the church is supposed to be transformational. It's supposed to change people's lives. If you notice those 3 words and then the 3 images that I just brought out from the Bible about Holy Temple and the Ark and Jesus' rib, none of them had to do with the music. Now, hold on. I love music. It's fantastic. It's obviously a gift from God, right? But I also made no mention of a church building. I made no mention of a denomination. I made no mention of the type of teaching or preaching that happens at that church, because what a church is supposed to be about is something that's deeper, and yet it like rises above all of those, petty squabbles that sometimes churches get into. It's like, I don't go to that church because their carpet's red. It's like, that has nothing to do with the church, right? So let's do this, okay? Let's try to figure out what is the church by talking about when it goes wrong, okay? Now, you can certainly go to church and you can experience really nasty people too, because all of us are nasty, right? We all have the ability to individually drag a whole church down if we're somebody who's angry and gossiping, and if we are people that like to pick fights about things that don't actually matter, If we ever come to church and we try to push a selfish agenda, or when we go to church and we try to shut down other people from having particular conversations, churches can go wrong in many, many different ways. But here's what I really like. The church ceases to be the church of Jesus when we stop being vulnerable with each other. The church of Jesus stops being the church when we no longer feel like we have any more growing to do. When we show up to church and we say, I have nothing really to learn, I'm just here to be seen, or I'm here just to catch up with other people. I'm not here to actually be confronted with my own evil. I'm here just to be encouraged only. The church ceases to be the church of Jesus Christ when the preaching centers around us rather than the people around us and how we can help them. The church ceases to be the church when we go to it expecting that we should be able to leave exactly the same, that it doesn't change us at all. Now, in the midst of all of this discussion and all of these comments about 3 images from the Bible and a few words, and then what is the church when it goes wrong, we've got to ask a very legitimate question. When did you feel the most alive? When in your life have you felt the most alive? The Greek word for church is ekklesia. It means an eclectic gathering, right? But the Hebrew word for church is even better from my perspective. It's adah, which means witnessing community. You have a good church when people are freely witnessing to one another about the glories and the failures of the past week. When you have a collection of people that you can come together and talk about what your strengths and your weaknesses were. But not often do we come to church thinking that it's a place where we give witness. We instead go to church so that we can maybe get a good sermon that comes towards us, so that we can have music that encourages us. That's all good. I'm not saying that's bad. But there's something missing when the church doesn't encourage people to share their story with one another. And if you've ever been on a youth retreat with me, I always like to remind us that when someone tells their own story, a life story from something that happened to them, it's like they're sharing a gift. They're sharing a part of themselves. I remember one time laying in a hammock with, I think the number was 17 other people in other individual hammocks. We had about 5 or 6 trees, and we just had this network of hammocks. And we were all laying in it, and we literally laid in our hammocks for, no lie, 8 hours straight. This is like an end of July, a few summers ago. And somebody would go off and bring back iced tea, and somebody else would go off and grab a sandwich for everyone. But we laid in those hammocks, telling frustrations and glories, successes and failures, weaknesses and triumphs, all through the lens of the Bible that we were all reading. And every single one of us, and these 17 people, each in their own individual hammocks, we fell into vulnerability. We didn't feel the need to tense up and prove to each other that we're always strong. We fell into being transparent. We didn't keep up a wall or a projection of what we hoped the other person thought we were. We actually let that drop and just become honestly who we were. And then in the midst of all of that, in that conversation, we allowed it to change us as we listened to each other's story and be like, well, I hear what you're going through, but can you consider maybe Jesus is in this frustration or failure or weakness in this way? And then it changed that person. Listen, brunch is real good, right? Of course it is. But brunch can be church if you have a group of people that you can give witness to the past week in light of Jesus. Anywhere, laying in hammocks can become an Adah community where you stop and you support one another with completely unconditional love. Okay, now, surely because of COVID, right, we maybe haven't seen each other in person on a Sunday morning as often as we maybe used to. But that doesn't mean that you can't have those types of vulnerable and transparent and transforming conversations with other Christians. And when you do that and 2 or 3 or more are gathered, somehow the Christ is present in even those. So I don't know what we're trying to do in this right now. I'm not really going to try to plead that you should come back to church. I'm going to do this stupid cliche thing and just say, be the church to one another. Go have a porch visit with someone else. Call someone up on the phone, or maybe just go for a bike ride around Narberth with someone and give witness to each other's lives. And then maybe along the way, you might find out that maybe Jesus was on the bike ride with you and that you just had a very fulfilling, very spiritual, but very grounded church experience. Now, as I said, brunch is real good. Omelets are real good. Orange juice, milk. I mean, I'm a big fan of iced tea, but in reality, brunch and eating good foods like that will never be better than having honest and real conversations where we bring Jesus into the midst of our own lives. That's where the real church is. Right now, we're in the guts of the church. We're in the basement in like the boiler room, and maybe some of you have never even been here before. You've been curious where this room is. Well, this is where the operations happen that keep the building going. But this is not really what keeps the church going. What keeps the church going is when we can connect with each other. So let's do that this week. May grace and peace be with each and every one of you. We'll catch you later.